I saw the color drain from Amber's face when I said, $47,832.16. That's the exact amount Margaret paid for this entire wedding you're trying to throw her out of. The reception hall went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne glasses. My hands were shaking, but I held up my phone with the bank statement clear as day on the screen. Amber's perfect crimson lips parted slightly, then closed again. For once in the 3 years I'd known her, my son's wife had absolutely nothing to say. The photographer lowered his camera slowly, clearly unsure if he should capture this moment. Several guests began whispering behind their hands, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. 5 seconds earlier, Amber had been shouting at the venue security to remove that interfering old woman immediately, while pointing at Margaret, who stood in her elegant navy dress, tears welling in her eyes. Margaret, who had not only funded this lavish affair, but had stayed up 3 nights, hand-stitching the lace on Amber's veil. Margaret, who was my best friend of 47 years and the kindest soul I'd ever known. Perhaps, I continued in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. You'd like to explain to everyone why you're throwing out the woman who made all of this possible. I gestured around at the crystal chandeliers, the cascading flower arrangements, the gourmet dinner that had cost $175 per plate. My son David stood frozen between his new wife and his mother, his face a mask of confusion and horror. The next words out of Amber's mouth would determine exactly what kind of family they were going to be. I met Margaret Holloway in the summer of 1975, when we were both young mothers, living on Maple Street in Riverdale. I had just moved in with my husband Tom and our 2-year-old son David. She appeared at my door with a homemade apple pie and a genuine smile that immediately put me at ease. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said. "The moving trucks are a dead giveaway. I'm Margaret from across the street, and this pie is still warm if you'd care for a slice." That simple act of kindness was the beginning of a friendship that would span nearly 5 decades and see us through marriages, divorces, children, grandchildren, and more life changes than either of us could have imagined. Margaret was already a widow by then, her husband Richard having died in Vietnam when their son James was just a baby. She worked as an accountant at the local credit union and somehow managed to keep her modest home immaculate while raising James alone. I admired her strength immediately. When my own marriage fell apart 3 years later, she was there with more pie, a shoulder to cry on, and practical advice about lawyer fees and child support. "Keep every receipt," she told me, sliding a small leather-bound notebook across her kitchen table. "Document everything. It's not about revenge, Susan. It's about protection." That notebook became my lifeline, and Margaret's methodical approach to record-keeping became a habit I never broke. Our children grew up together, playing in the sprinklers in summer and building snow forts in winter. David and James were inseparable despite their 2-year age difference, and Margaret and I joked that we were raising them as brothers. We carpooled 2 Little League games, took turns hosting sleepovers, and consoled each other through the unique heartbreaks of parenthood. James's broken arm from falling out of our oak tree, David's struggles with reading, both boys' first rejections from girls they'd had crushes on. Through it all, Margaret remained my rock, level-headed, generous with both her time and resources, and unfailingly kind. What most people didn't know was that Margaret had inherited a substantial trust fund when she turned 40. Her late husband's family had old money, and while she lived modestly, she had considerable wealth tucked away in investments. "It's James's legacy," she explained when she confided in me about it. "But I want him to work for his own success first." True to her word, she put James through college without touching the trust, using her own salary, and only revealed the extent of his inheritance when he completed his MBA at 28. By then, he had already met Amber. They met at a charity gala in Boston, where James was working as a financial analyst and Amber was coordinating the event. She was striking tall, blonde, with a calculated charm that could win over a room in minutes. I still remember the first time James brought her to Margaret's for Sunday dinner. "She's different from his other girlfriends," Margaret whispered to me in the kitchen as we prepared dessert. "Very polished." There was something in her tone that gave me pause, but I brushed it aside. James was clearly smitten, gazing at Amber across the table as she regaled us with stories about the celebrities she'd worked with. "This one time, at the Met Gala, I personally saved Meryl Streep from a wardrobe malfunction," she said, leaning forward conspiratorially. She sends me a Christmas card every year now. I'll admit, I was impressed at first. Amber had a way of making her life sound glamorous and important. It wasn't until later, when I helped Margaret clear the dishes, that I noticed something odd. Did you see how she kept checking her phone under the table? Margaret asked. Every time James started talking about his work or his friends, her eyes would glaze over. But the minute he mentioned that bonus he's expecting, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I'd seen it too, the sudden sharpening of Amber's gaze, the way she'd placed her hand on James's arm and asked seemingly casual questions about his company's compensation structure. In retrospect, we should have recognized the pattern right then. The engagement came 6 months later. James proposed at the top of the Empire State Building, with a diamond that cost him 3 months' salary. Amber immediately created an elaborate wedding website and Instagram account to document every moment of their journey to forever, as she called it. The hashtag #JamBER Ever After appeared on social media, accompanied by professional quality engagement photos and daily countdowns. Margaret tried to be supportive, but I could tell she was concerned about the mounting expenses. He called me asking about tapping into some of his trust fund early, she confided one afternoon over coffee. Apparently, Amber has her heart set on a destination wedding in the Maldives. What followed was 18 months of escalating demands, thinly veiled manipulations, and an increasingly isolated James. The Maldives plan was eventually abandoned. The resort Amber wanted was booked solid for 2 years, but the alternative was hardly less extravagant: a full weekend of celebrations at the Langham Resort in Boston, with a rehearsal dinner for 80 guests, a Saturday ceremony and reception for 250, and a farewell brunch on Sunday. The estimated cost had ballooned to over $100,000, and James was becoming visibly stressed about finances. "Mom," I overheard him say to Margaret on the phone one evening when he was visiting me, "I know we talked about using the trust fund for a house down payment, but is there any way I could use some of it for the wedding instead? Amber says this only happens once and she's dreamed of it her whole life. I'll never forget the look on Margaret's face when she came to me the next day, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of anger and hurt. He wants me to sign over $60,000 for flower arrangements and a designer dress," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. When I suggested something more reasonable, he told me that Amber cried all night and accused him of not truly loving her. Margaret paced my living room, her normally calm demeanor shattered. "I raised him better than this, Susan. I taught him the value of money, of hard work, and now this woman has him convinced that spending the equivalent of a college education on a single day is normal." But Margaret's love for her son overrode her better judgment, as it so often does for mothers. After several tense discussions, she agreed to help with the wedding costs, but on her terms. "I'll pay the vendors directly," she told James firmly when they met for dinner at her house. I was there, supposedly to help with the cooking, but really, as moral support for Margaret. I want contracts, invoices, everything properly documented. And this counts against your eventual inheritance. James, this isn't free money. Amber, who had arrived 30 minutes late wearing sunglasses indoors and complaining of a migraine, suddenly perked up when the financial discussion began. "That's so generous, Margaret," she cooed, reaching across the table to squeeze her future mother-in-law's hand. "We'll make sure you're acknowledged in the program as a major contributor." The next several months were a study in subtle power dynamics. Amber began stopping by Margaret's house unannounced, always with a wedding magazine or vendor catalog in hand. "I just knew you'd want to be involved in these decisions," she'd say, spreading out photos of $400 centerpieces or sample menus for the rehearsal dinner. "Since you're so generously helping, your opinion really matters to me." But whenever Margaret suggested more economical options, Amber would pull out what became her signature move, the trembling lip, followed by a carefully constructed statement designed to make Margaret feel unreasonable. "I guess I just thought this one special day was worth celebrating properly." Or James said, "You wanted us to have the wedding of our dreams." But maybe I misunderstood. Margaret started documenting everything in one of her meticulous notebooks: dates, amounts, conversations. "It's not that I don't trust her," she told me one afternoon as we shared a pot of tea at my kitchen table. "But something doesn't feel right." She slid the leather-bound book across to me, opened to a page where she'd listed recent expenditures. The numbers were staggering. $12,000 for a photographer and videographer, $9,500 for the band, $22,000 for the venue and catering deposit. She added a raw bar and champagne tower after I'd already signed the initial contract, Margaret said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against an amended invoice. When I questioned it, she said James had approved it, and when I asked him, he looked confused but then quickly agreed that he had. Have you considered just saying no? I asked gently, knowing the answer before Margaret even spoke. Her eyes, normally bright and clear, clouded with worry. I'm afraid of losing him, Susan, she admitted. Amber has this way of isolating him. Their couples therapist apparently suggested they create stronger boundaries with family. Did you know they have a joint email account? Now, and when I call his cell phone, she often answers. The leather notebook contained other concerning notes. James had missed his monthly dinner with his mother 3 times in a row. He'd forgotten Margaret's birthday for the first time in his adult life. When he did visit, Amber was always with him, and he seemed to check with her before answering even the most basic questions about his own preferences or schedule. I took a deep breath and decided it was time for some hard truth. Margaret, honey, that's not couples therapy. That's isolation, and it's a classic tactic of controlling partners. The words hung in the air between us as Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I know, she whispered. I've been reading about it, but what can I do? If I push too hard, I'm afraid. She cut me off completely. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. We document, we stay present, we look for opportunities, and we make sure that no matter what happens, James knows you're there for him. Little did I know then how prophetic those words would be, or that the wedding itself would become the battleground for this quiet war. The final straw came 3 weeks before the wedding. James and Amber had come for dinner at Margaret's house, ostensibly to finalize some details. I was there again, this time actually helping with the cooking. Margaret's famous roast chicken with rosemary potatoes that had been James's favorite meal since childhood. The evening started pleasantly enough, with Amber complimenting Margaret's home. Such a charming little place, she said, running her finger along the mantel where family photos were displayed. So full of history. The slight pause made the words sound more like outdated than cherished. But Margaret just smiled and thanked her. James seemed tense, checking his watch repeatedly and drinking his wine faster than usual. When Margaret went to the kitchen to check on dessert, I followed to help bring out coffee. Cuffs. Something's wrong, she whispered, her hands shaking slightly as she arranged petit fours on her grandmother's china plate. James has barely made eye contact all night. We returned to find Amber showing James something on her phone, both of them speaking in hushed tones that immediately ceased when we entered the room. Everything all right? Margaret asked, setting down the dessert. James cleared his throat. Actually, Mom, we wanted to talk to you about the ceremony. He glanced at Amber, who gave him a small nod. We've been going over the final details, and we think it might be best if you attend as a guest rather than participate in the processional. Margaret's face remained impressively composed, but I saw her knuckles whiten around the edge of the serving tray she still held. I see, she said quietly. May I ask why? Amber jumped in, her voice syrupy sweet. It's just that the bridal party has a very specific aesthetic we're going for. The bridesmaids are all wearing a particular shade of blush that would clash with your complexion, Margaret. She reached out to pat Margaret's hand in a gesture that managed to be both condescending and dismissive. Plus, the mother-son dance would throw off our timeline. The venue only gives us the space until midnight. And with the fireworks display and the drone light show, something had to give. I watched as something shifted in Margaret's eyes, a subtle hardening, a resolve forming. She carefully set down the tray and reached for her purse, which hung on the back of a dining chair. Without a word, she extracted a small leather notebook, not the one I'd seen her using to document wedding expenses, but another, older one. She flipped it open to a page marked with a silk ribbon. James, she said, her voice steady now. Do you remember when you were 7, and you came home from school crying because Tommy Watkins made fun of your science project? James looked startled by the apparent non-sequitur, but he nodded slowly. You told me that day that when you grew up, you wanted to have a family where everyone was kind to each other. Is this what kindness looks like to you now? The room fell silent. I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking each second of the excruciating tension. Amber's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of wounded innocence. I don't think that's fair, Margaret. We're just trying to have the wedding day we've envisioned. Margaret didn't look at her. She kept her eyes fixed on her son's face. James, I have supported every decision you've made. I've written checks totaling $47,832.16 so far for this wedding. I've stayed quiet when vendors were changed without consulting me, when the guest list doubled, when my own brother, your Uncle David, was cut because Amber thought he wouldn't fit the vibe. But I will not be erased from one of the most important days of your life to accommodate a drone light show. James had the decency to look ashamed. Mom, it's not like that. We just thought, but Amber interrupted him. Actually, there's something else we need to discuss. Her voice had lost its sugary quality, taking on a harder edge. We've decided we'd like you to transfer the remaining wedding fund to us directly. It's causing too much confusion having you pay vendors separately. Margaret closed her notebook calmly and returned it to her purse. No, she said simply. Amber blinked, clearly not accustomed to being refused. Excuse me. Margaret folded her hands on the table. I said no. The arrangement was that I would pay vendors directly. That arrangement stands. What happened next haunts me still. Amber's face contorted into an expression of such naked rage that I instinctively took a step back. You controlling witch, she hissed, all pretense abandoned. You've been trying to sabotage this wedding from day one because you can't stand not being the most important woman in James's life anymore. She turned to James, tears now streaming down her face in what I recognized as a calculated performance. She's trying to ruin everything we've worked for, baby. All because she's lonely and bitter and can't let go. I expected James to defend his mother, to recognize the manipulation for what it was. Instead, he put his arm around Amber and glared at Margaret. Mom, I think you should apologize. Margaret stood up slowly, dignity in every line of her body. I will not apologize for protecting what's mine and what's yours. James, when you're ready to have a real conversation, my door is always open to you. She walked to the front door and opened it, a clear dismissal. Until then, I think it's best you both leave. James hesitated, something like doubt flickering across his features, but Amber was already grabbing her purse and storming toward the exit. Come on, James, we don't need her money. My parents will help. It was a bluff. Amber's parents, as we'd learned through casual conversation over the months, were solidly middle class and had already stretched themselves thin, contributing to the wedding. But James followed her anyway, pausing only briefly at the threshold. I'm sorry you feel this way, Mom, he said stiffly, in words that were clearly not his own. After they left, Margaret collapsed onto her sofa, tears finally spilling over. What have I done? She whispered, her voice breaking. I've lost him. I sat beside her and took her hand. No, I said firmly. You've stood your ground. There's a difference. We stayed like that for hours, talking through options, making plans. By midnight, Margaret had made a decision. I won't cancel what I've already paid for, she said. That would only punish James, but I'm not giving them a cent more, and I'm certainly not going to sit quietly in the back row while my son gets married. I nodded, relieved that she wasn't giving up. So what's the plan? Margaret's smile was sad but determined. I'm going to that wedding, Susan, and I'm bringing receipts. The following day, Margaret received a text from James. Amber and I have discussed it, and we think it's best if you don't attend the wedding. We'll arrange to pay you back for everything over time. She showed it to me with hands that trembled slightly before putting her phone face down on the counter. He doesn't even have the courage to call me, she said softly. I watched as she moved around her kitchen, with deliberate calm, making us both tea as she had thousands of times before. Only the occasional clink of a spoon against china betrayed her distress. I raised him better than this, she repeated, more to herself than to me. Where did I go wrong? I couldn't bear to see my friends suffering, to watch as this woman who had been nothing but generous and loving was being systematically cut out of her only child's life. We need reinforcements, I declared, pulling out my own phone. Within an hour, I had spoken to James's godfather, Robert, Margaret's brother-in-law, his childhood best friend Tyler, and his favorite cousin Jennifer. Each was shocked by what I told them, and each promised to reach out to James separately. Don't mention that I called, I instructed them. Just express concern. See if you can get him alone, away from Amber. Margaret watched my campaign with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. I don't want to make things worse, she fretted. We won't, I assured her, though I was far from certain myself. We're just creating space for him to think clearly. Robert was the first to report back. He'd invited James for lunch at their old favorite diner, ostensibly to discuss a wedding gift. He kept checking his phone the entire time. Robert told us later that evening, sitting in Margaret's living room. When I asked about the ceremony, he gave me these rehearsed-sounding answers about starting fresh and creating boundaries. But when I specifically asked why Margaret wasn't welcome, he couldn't look me in the eye. Tyler's experience was similar. James had agreed to meet for a quick beer, but Amber had shown up halfway through, claiming she just happened to be shopping nearby. Jennifer had the most success, cornering James at his office and demanding answers. He finally admitted that Amber thinks Margaret is financially controlling and emotionally manipulative, she reported. When I pointed out the irony of that accusation, he shut down completely. Despite these interventions, James remained firm in his decision. The wedding was now just 2 weeks away, and Margaret was officially uninvited. What Amber didn't know, however, was that Margaret's name was still on all the vendor contracts. She was technically the client, not the bride and groom. I could cancel everything with a single phone call, Margaret mused darkly one evening as we reviewed her extensive documentation. The leather notebook now contained not just financial records but a detailed timeline of Amber's escalating behavior. But I won't, because despite everything, I want James to have his day. I squeezed her hand in silent support, marveling at her strength. Just promise me you'll keep these records safe, I said. Something tells me we're going to need them. That night, Margaret made a decision that would ultimately change everything. I'm going to transfer all vendor relationships to them, she announced over breakfast the next morning. I nearly choked on my coffee. What? Why? Margaret's smile was enigmatic. Because sometimes you have to let people face the consequences of their actions. I've paid what I promised, $50,000 total. The remaining balance, due to all vendors combined, is just over $27,000, due the week before the wedding. James and Amber can figure out how to cover it. She picked up her phone and began composing an email. I'm informing all vendors that while I've paid the deposits and scheduled installments, final payments will come directly from the bride and groom. And I'm copying James and Amber so there are no surprises. The response was immediate and predictable. Amber called Margaret 6 times in succession, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that evolved from saccharine. There seems to be a misunderstanding. Call me back so we can sort this out. To accusatory, you're deliberately sabotaging us because you can't stand not controlling everything. Too desperately placating, we can work this out. I'm sure we just got off on the wrong foot. James's approach was more direct. He showed up at Margaret's door that evening, alone, for the first time in months. Can we talk? He asked, his expression a mixture of anger and anxiety that made him look suddenly very young. Margaret stepped aside to let him in, her face carefully neutral. I was sitting in the living room and started to leave to give them privacy, but Margaret gestured for me to stay. There are no secrets here, she said simply. The conversation that followed was both heartbreaking and illuminating. James paced the living room, running his hands through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of his childhood frustrations that I felt a pang of nostalgia. Mom, what are you doing? We have final payments due in 10 days. The Langham requires the balance in full, a week before the event, or they cancel. Margaret sat calmly, hands folded in her lap. I'm aware of that, James. I've fulfilled my commitment, $50,000, which is actually $10,000 more than we originally discussed. The remaining balance is your responsibility. James stopped pacing to stare at her incredulously. But you knew we were counting on you for the full amount. Amber's already ordered additional favors. We've upgraded the menu, added a raw bar, without consulting me. Margaret interjected quietly. Just as you decided not to consult me before uninviting me from my only child's wedding. Her voice remained steady, but I could see the pain in her eyes. James had the grace to look ashamed, but only briefly. That's different. The wedding day is about Amber and me, not you. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, it is about you, both of you. And I hope it's everything you want it to be. But my checkbook is not part of your marriage vows. She rose and walked to her desk in the corner of the room, returning with a file folder. Here are copies of all contracts. receipts for what I've paid, and the contact information for each vendor. You have 10 days to figure out the remaining $27,403.52. The color drained from James's face as he flipped through the documentation, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. We don't have this kind of money just sitting around, Mom. Amber's parents already maxed out their credit cards on the rehearsal dinner. His voice had taken on a desperate quality that made my heart ache. Margaret remained resolute. Then, perhaps it's time to make some difficult decisions about what's truly important. Scaled-back receptions can be lovely. So can courthouse weddings. James threw the folder onto the coffee table, papers scattering across the surface. This is exactly what Amber said you'd do. Use money to control me when things don't go your way. Margaret flinched as if he'd slapped her, and I couldn't stay silent any longer. James Holloway, I said sharply, I've known you since you were in diapers, and I never thought I'd see the day when you'd speak to your mother that way. I stood up and gathered the scattered papers, tapping them into a neat stack. Your mother raised you alone after your father died serving this country. She worked 60-hour weeks to give you everything you needed. She put you through college, debt-free, and now she's given you $50,000 for a wedding that she's not even invited to. Where exactly is the control in that equation? James stared at me, momentarily thrown by my intervention. In the silence that followed, Margaret spoke again, her voice softer now. Honey, I love you more than anything in this world. But love doesn't mean letting someone treat you poorly, and it doesn't mean funding decisions that go against everything I've taught you about financial responsibility. She reached for his hand, and to my relief, he didn't pull away. I want you to be happy. I want your marriage to be successful. But starting that marriage with a wedding you can't afford, while cutting out the people who love you most, isn't setting you up for success. Something in her words seemed to reach him. For a moment, the James the first knew, thoughtful, kind-hearted, sensible James, resurfaced. I don't know what to do, he admitted, suddenly looking exhausted. Amber has her heart set on everything being perfect. She says her clients and industry contacts will be judging every detail. Margaret squeezed his hand. Then perhaps it's time for an honest conversation about priorities. Marriage isn't about one perfect day, it's about building a life together on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and open communication. James nodded slowly, then checked his watch and stood up abruptly. I need to go. Amber's expecting me back by 9. Just like that, the moment of connection was gone. He left with the folder tucked under his arm, a troubled expression on his face. As the door closed behind him, Margaret turned to me with tears in her eyes. He's going to choose her, she said softly. Isn't he? The answer came the very next day. Not from James directly, but from the Langham Resort's events coordinator, who called Margaret in a state of professional concern. Mrs. Holloway, I wanted to touch base regarding some changes to the contract. Your son and his fiancée have requested significant downgrades to reduce the final balance. The coordinator, Diane, had worked closely with Margaret throughout the planning process and had clearly picked up on the underlying tension. They've eliminated the raw bar, switched from the premium open bar to a consumption model, and reduced the floral budget by 40%. Even with these changes, they're still about $15,000 short of the minimum required at this point. Margaret thanked her for the information and assured her she would sort things out, though exactly how remained unclear. Over the next week, we received periodic updates through Margaret's network of vigilant allies. Jennifer reported that James and Amber were having explosive fights about the wedding. Tyler mentioned that James had asked to crash on his couch for a night after a particularly bad argument. Robert, who had connections at the Langham through his work as a corporate event planner, informed us that Amber had made a scene in the events office, accusing them of collusion with Margaret to sabotage her special day. Through it all, Margaret maintained her position. She would not contribute another penny beyond what she had already paid. 3 days before the wedding, the situation reached a breaking point. James appeared at Margaret's door again, this time looking thoroughly defeated. Amber broke up with me, he said as soon as Margaret opened the door. She says if I can't give her the wedding she deserves, then I'm not the man she thought I was. He collapsed onto the sofa, head in his hands. She's right. I'm a failure. Margaret sat beside him and pulled him into her arms, just as she had when he was a little boy with skinned knees or a bruised heart. No, Sweetheart, she murmured into his hair. You're not a failure. You're just finally seeing the truth. What followed was a night of painful revelations. James admitted that Amber had been gradually isolating him from friends and family, criticizing his clothes, his job, even the way he spoke. She always framed it as helping me improve, he said, the disillusionment evident in his voice. And I believed her because, well, she's beautiful and sophisticated and seems to know how to navigate social situations so much better than I do. He confessed that Amber had been the one pushing for the increasingly lavish wedding, insisting that it would help her career in event planning to have photos of their upscale nuptials in her portfolio. She told me your generation just doesn't understand modern weddings, that this was a normal investment in our future. By morning, some difficult decisions had been made. James would offer Amber a choice: proceed with the scaled-back wedding they could actually afford, or postpone until they could save up for the event she envisioned. Either way, Margaret would be included in the celebration. And we're going to couples counseling, James added firmly. Real counseling, not whatever that was before. Margaret didn't say, "I told you so." She simply held her son's hand and promised to support whatever choice he made, as long as it came from a place of mutual respect and honest communication. To everyone's surprise, Amber agreed to the scaled-back wedding, though not without conditions. She says she'll only go forward if she maintains complete control over the guest list and seating arrangements. James reported after a tense 3-hour conversation with his fiancée. And she wants you there, Mom, but seated at the back with the distant relatives. Margaret accepted these terms with gracious dignity. It's her wedding day, she said simply. As long as I can witness my son's marriage, that's what matters. I wasn't entirely convinced by her serenity, but I kept my doubts to myself. After all, Margaret had proven herself to be several steps ahead throughout this entire ordeal. The rehearsal dinner was a study in strained politeness. Amber's parents, Tom and Valerie, seemed uncomfortable and overwhelmed, likely due to the significant credit card debt they'd incurred funding the event. Margaret, seated at a table far from the bridal party, maintained a pleasant smile throughout the evening. I sat beside her, providing running commentary to keep her spirits up. If her dress was cut any lower, they could charge it as a second guest. I whispered as Amber kissed her way around the room, in a white rehearsal dinner outfit that left little to the imagination. Margaret stifled a laugh and squeezed my hand gratefully. James made a point of stopping by our table several times, clearly trying to bridge the gap between his mother and his bride. Everything looks wonderful, Margaret told him sincerely. Are you happy, sweetheart? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and he hesitated before answering. I'm getting there, he said finally. We have a lot to work through, but I think we're on the right track. He glanced over his shoulder at Amber, who was watching their interaction with barely concealed impatience. I should get back, he said apologetically. But I'll see you tomorrow, Mom. Front row or back row, what matters is that you're there. As he walked away, Margaret turned to me with a small, sad smile. He's still going through with it, she said softly. I nodded, having reached the same conclusion. But with eyes more open than before, I reminded her. That's something. Margaret took a sip of her wine and straightened her shoulders. Indeed it is. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow will be interesting. There was something in her tone, a hint of the strategic accountant who had built a comfortable life from nothing, that made me suddenly very curious about what she had planned. Margaret Holloway, I said, narrowing my eyes playfully. What are you up to? She just patted my hand and smiled enigmatically. Just being prepared, Susan. Just being prepared. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, a perfect May Saturday that seemed designed for celebrations. Margaret and I arrived at the Langham together, both of us dressed elegantly, but not flashily. Her navy blue dress was sophisticated and flattering, with delicate pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. I wore a deep emerald ensemble that Margaret assured me brought out the green in my hazel eyes. We were directed 2 seats in the second-to-last row of the ceremony space. Technically not the back, but certainly not where the mother of the groom would traditionally sit. Margaret accepted this placement without comment, but I noticed she kept her large designer handbag close at her side rather than under her seat. The ceremony space was undeniably beautiful, despite the budget cuts. White roses and hydrangeas adorned the end of each row, and a floral arch framed the altar where James already stood with the officiant and his groomsmen. The string quartet began playing Canon in D, signaling the start of the procession. Amber's bridesmaids filed in wearing the blush gowns that supposedly would have clashed with Margaret's complexion. Then came the flower girl, Amber's niece, scattering rose petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Finally, the music changed to the bridal march, and everyone stood as Amber appeared in the doorway on her father's arm. I have to admit, she was a vision in her custom gown with its cathedral-length train and intricate beadwork. Her father looked simultaneously proud and terrified as he escorted her down the aisle, possibly calculating the final credit card bill in his head with each step. When they reached the altar, the officiant asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" And her father responded with the traditional, "Her mother and I do," before taking his seat beside his visibly emotional wife. The ceremony proceeded smoothly, with personal vows that made even my skeptical heart soften a little. James promised to support your dreams and stand by your side through whatever challenges we face. Amber vowed to honor your kind heart and gentle spirit, which drew me to you from the first moment we met. When the officiant asked if anyone had reason to object to this union, I felt Margaret tense beside me, but she remained silent. Rings were exchanged, a unity candle lit, and finally, James and Amber were pronounced husband and wife. As they kissed, the guests applauded, and the string quartet began playing again. The newlyweds practically danced back down the aisle, Amber beaming triumphantly, and James looking relieved and happy. Margaret clapped along with everyone else, her expression giving nothing away. "Phase 1 complete," she murmured, almost to herself. Before I could ask what she meant, we were being ushered out for the room flip and directed to the cocktail hour in an adjacent space. The cocktail hour revealed the first signs that Amber was still smarting from the budget cuts. Instead of the elaborate display of hors d'oeuvres she had initially planned, there were simple past appetizers. The open bar offered wine, beer, and a signature cocktail, but no premium spirits. Amber's smile grew increasingly fixed as she circulated among guests, who innocently asked, "Where's the raw bar I heard so much about?" Or, "I thought there was going to be a champagne tower." James trailed slightly behind her, making apologetic small talk and shooting anxious glances toward Margaret, who was chatting amiably with distant relatives near the windows overlooking the Boston harbor. I was fetching another glass of white wine when I overheard Amber hissing at the venue coordinator. "This is completely unacceptable. I specifically requested the napkins be folded in the rose shape, not this basic triangle." The coordinator, Diane, maintained her professional composure admirably. "Ms. Miller, excuse me, Mrs. Holloway, the final contract specified standard napkin folds after the budget adjustments. I have the paperwork right here if you'd like to review it." Amber's perfectly contoured face flushed with anger. "I don't need to see paperwork. I need people to do their jobs correctly. This is my day." James appeared at her elbow, gently steering her away from the increasingly uncomfortable staff member. "Sweetheart, it's just napkins. Everything looks beautiful." By the time guests were invited into the reception space, the tension was palpable. Amber had clearly been crying and had disappeared to touch up her makeup, leaving James to escort both mothers to their tables. According to the seating chart, Margaret was placed at table 19, about as far from the head table as physically possible, while still being in the same room. James looked embarrassed as he led her to her assigned seat. "I'm sorry, Mom. I tried to change it, but Amber was insistent on the final arrangements." Margaret patted his cheek affectionately. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. Go, enjoy your day." As he walked away, she turned to me with that same enigmatic smile I'd noticed the night before. "Almost time," she said cryptically. The reception began with the grand entrance of the wedding party, followed by the newlyweds' first dance to Perfect by Ed Sheeran. Amber had clearly had some dance training. Her movements were precise and camera-ready as she and James swayed in perfect rhythm. Dinner service began shortly after, a plated affair that, while lovely, was noticeably less extravagant than what had originally been planned. I caught Amber's mother, Valerie, looking worriedly at her husband several times, particularly when the significantly reduced flower arrangements were mentioned by another guest at our table. There were supposed to be tall centerpieces with orchids, she explained in a strained whisper, but there were some last-minute adjustments. After the salad course, the best man rose for his toast. Tyler, James's childhood friend who had been part of our intervention effort, delivered a speech that walked a diplomatic tightrope, warm enough to seem genuine, but with subtle references that only those in the know would catch. I've watched James grow from a thoughtful, generous boy into a thoughtful, generous man, he said, raising his champagne flute. He's always been someone who would give you the shirt off his back, even when he shouldn't. He paused, making brief eye contact with Margaret. To James and Amber, may your marriage be built on honesty, mutual respect, and healthy boundaries. The emphasis on healthy boundaries was slight but unmistakable. Amber's smile remained fixed in place, but her eyes had narrowed dangerously. The maid of honor's speech was next, a gushing tribute to Amber's perfectionism and exacting standards. Amber has always known exactly what she wants and exactly how to get it, her cousin Brittany declared proudly. I've never met anyone more determined or unstoppable. The irony was apparently lost on her, though I noticed several guests exchanging glances. Dinner continued, and I kept waiting for the traditional mother-son dance that usually followed the meal. Instead, the DJ announced it was time for cake cutting. I leaned toward Margaret. Nope. Dance. She shook her head slightly. Eliminated in the budget cuts, she murmured, along with my mother's pearl cake server that's been used at family weddings for 4 generations. The cake, still impressive despite being downgraded from the original 7-tier design, was cut with appropriate ceremony. James and Amber fed each other small bites, thankfully without the tacky cake smashing that seems to be popular at so many weddings these days. As dessert was being served, I noticed a commotion near the entrance to the ballroom. Diane, the venue coordinator, was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with a man in an expensive suit who was gesturing emphatically at a tablet he held. Margaret followed my gaze and straightened slightly in her seat. Right on time, she said under her breath, reaching for her handbag. The man in the suit made his way to the head table, leaning down to speak directly to Amber, whose expression transformed from irritation to alarm. In seconds she turned to James, whispering furiously in his ear. He looked confused, then concerned, then stood up abruptly and followed both Amber and the suited man out of the ballroom. Margaret rose as well. I believe that's my cue, she said calmly. Would you like to come along? I didn't need to be asked twice. We made our way across the reception hall, nodding politely to guests who called out greetings, until we reached the door through which the others had disappeared. We found them in a small conference room adjacent to the ballroom. Amber was in full meltdown mode, mascara streaming down her face as she jabbed her finger at the suited man's tablet. This is extortion, she was shouting. You can't just change the terms on our wedding day. The man, who I now recognized as Mr. Sullivan, the Langham's director of events, maintained a professional demeanor despite the bride's histrionics. Mrs. Holloway, nothing has changed. The final payment was due in full last week. Accepted a partial payment as a courtesy, with the understanding that the balance would be settled before the reception began. That hasn't happened. James looked utterly bewildered. I don't understand. I thought everything was paid for. Amber rounded on him, her carefully cultivated poise completely abandoned. Oh, don't be so naive, James. Your mother pulled her funding at the last minute, remember? We had to cut corners everywhere, and yes, I put the remaining balance on my credit card. But it was declined this morning. She turned back to Mr. Sullivan, switching tactics from rage to pleading. Please, can't we just settle this tomorrow? It's our wedding day. The event director shook his head regretfully. I'm afraid our policy is quite clear. Without full payment, we cannot continue with the reception events. The venue rental expires at midnight regardless, but we would need to wrap things up now. Margaret chose this moment to make her presence known, stepping fully into the room with me right behind her. Is there a problem? She asked mildly, as if she hadn't been anticipating this exact scenario for days. Amber's expression morphed from desperation to fury in an instant. You, she snarled. This is your doing. You've been trying to ruin my wedding from the beginning. She advanced on Margaret with such naked aggression that James had to physically step between them. Amber, stop it. My mother has nothing to do with this. We knew the payment was due. Actually, Mr. Sullivan interjected, consulting his tablet again. The original contract was with Mrs. Margaret Holloway. She transferred responsibility for the final payments to you 2 weeks ago, with written acknowledgement from both of you that the remaining balance of $27,403.52 would be due 1 week before the event. He scrolled through his documents. We received a payment of $12,000 3 days ago, leaving a balance of $15,403.52, which was to be charged to the card on file. This morning, that charge was declined. James turned to Amber, confusion evident on his face. I thought you said your parents were covering the rest. Amber's fury momentarily gave way to panic. They were supposed to, but their cards were maxed out from the rehearsal dinner, so I used my Amex. She glared at Margaret again. None of this would have happened if your mother had just paid what she promised in the first place. This accusation was so blatantly unfair that I couldn't help but interject. Margaret paid $50,000. Amber, that's $10,000 more than she initially agreed to, for a wedding she wasn't even invited to until 3 days ago. Amber ignored me completely, turning to Mr. Sullivan with renewed desperation. You can't just shut down our wedding. There are 200 people out there. The dancing hasn't even started. The event director's expression remained professionally sympathetic, but firm. I understand this is distressing, Mrs. Holloway, but our policy, he was interrupted by Amber's shrill demand, call security. Have them remove this woman. She pointed directly at Margaret. She's not welcome here anymore. A stunned silence fell over the room. James looked horrified. Amber, what are you doing? That's my mother. Mr. Sullivan appeared deeply uncomfortable but obligated to address the bride's request. Ma'am, while we do have security available if needed, I'm not sure that's Amber cut him off again, her voice reaching a near hysterical pitch. I want her out. She's deliberately sabotaging my day. Call security now and have that interfering old woman removed immediately. She pointed at Margaret with a shaking finger, mascara tracks creating dark rivers down her expertly contoured cheeks. And that's when I did it. I stepped forward, my own anger finally boiling over after months of watching this woman manipulate and hurt my best friend. I saw the color drained from Amber's face when I said, $47,803, 216. That's the exact amount, Margaret. Paid for this entire wedding you're trying to throw her out of. The room went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne glasses. My hands were shaking, but I held up my phone with the bank statement clear as day on the screen. Amber's perfect crimson lips parted slightly, then closed again. For once in the 3 years I'd known her, my son's wife had absolutely nothing to say. The stillness that followed my outburst seemed to stretch for an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. James broke it first, turning to look at his new wife with dawning comprehension. You told me my mother only contributed $25,000, he said slowly. You said your parents were covering almost half. Amber's expression flickered between defiance and panic. That's not. She's lying. But her protest lacked conviction, especially when faced with the evidence on my phone screen, a detailed spreadsheet showing every payment Margaret had made, each date and amount meticulously documented. Margaret finally spoke, her voice gentle despite everything. James, I never wanted it to come to this, but you deserved to know the truth before you started your married life. She turned to Mr. Sullivan, who was watching the family drama unfold with professional neutrality. I understand there's a balance due of $15,403.52. The event director nodded, clearly relieved that someone was addressing the actual financial issue. Margaret reached into her handbag and extracted a checkbook. I'll cover the remaining balance, on one condition. She paused, meeting Amber's gaze directly for the first time. That everyone here agrees that honesty will be the foundation of this marriage going forward. The implication was clear, and James understood it immediately. He turned to Amber, his expression a complex mixture of hurt, anger, and determination. No more lies, he said firmly. No more manipulation. No more isolating me from the people I love. If we're going to have any chance at making this work, it starts with complete transparency. Amber seemed to deflate before our eyes, the fight leaving her body as she realized her position was untenable. Fine, she muttered, not meeting anyone's gaze. Whatever you want. Margaret wrote the check with steady hands and handed it to Mr. Sullivan. Please ensure that the rest of the evening proceeds as planned, she said with quiet dignity. These young people have a lot to discuss, but their guests shouldn't have. Their celebration cut short. The event director accepted the check gratefully. Of course, Mrs. Holloway, and may I say, you've been extremely patient and professional throughout this entire process." He excused himself to process the payment, leaving the four of us alone in the conference room. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, James approached his mother and enveloped her in a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with remorse. "Should have trusted you. I should have seen what was happening." Margaret returned his embrace, tears finally spilling onto her cheeks. "You see it now," she said simply. "That's what matters." Over James's shoulder, she caught my eye and mouthed a silent thank you for standing up for her, for bringing the truth to light, for being there through it all. Amber stood apart from this reconciliation, arms crossed defensively across her beaded bodice, when James finally released his mother and turned back to his bride. His expression had hardened. "We're going back out there," he said in a tone that brooked no argument. "We're going to smile and dance and cut the cake again if we have to. But tomorrow, we're having a very serious conversation about our future." Amber opened her mouth as if to protest, then, apparently thought better of it, and nodded stiffly. "Fine," she repeated, reaching for a tissue from her clutch to repair her makeup. But this isn't over. How right she was, though not in the way she intended. The reception continued with a strained normalcy. The first dance was repeated for guests who had missed it. The cake was served. The DJ played all the standard wedding hits. Margaret was moved to table 1 at James's insistence, right beside the head table. I stayed by her side, both of us watching as Amber maintained a brittle smile through the father-daughter dance, the bouquet toss, all the expected traditions. But beneath the surface, fundamental shifts had occurred that would change everything. The morning after the wedding, James showed up at Margaret's house alone. Amber had left their hotel suite before dawn, leaving behind her wedding ring and a note that said, "Only I deserve better than this." Instead of being devastated, James seemed almost relieved. "I think I've known for months that this was wrong," he admitted as we sat around Margaret's kitchen table, just as we had countless times throughout his childhood. "I just couldn't admit it to myself." Margaret poured him more coffee and squeezed his hand. "Sometimes the hardest person to be honest with is yourself," she said wisely. The marriage was annulled 6 weeks later on grounds of fraud, after James discovered that Amber had been lying about far more than just wedding finances. Her claims about celebrity clients were fabricated. Her supposed master's degree was never completed. Even her designer wardrobe turned out to be mostly counterfeits purchased online. "It's like I was in love with a completely fictional person," James told us one evening, over dinner at Margaret's house. "The scary part is how close I came to cutting all of you out of my life for someone who never really existed." As for Margaret, she never said "I told you so." She never demanded repayment of the money she'd spent on the wedding. She simply welcomed her son back into her life with open arms and helped him rebuild his confidence and trust in his own judgment. The leather notebook where she'd documented everything went back into a drawer. Its purpose served. "Some lessons cost money," she told me philosophically, "but they're still cheaper than a lifetime of regret." 3 years later, when James met Elizabeth, a kind, unpretentious pediatric nurse with a genuine smile and no interest whatsoever in extravagant displays, Margaret was the first person he brought her to meet. Their wedding, held in Margaret's backyard the following spring, cost less than $5,000 and was filled with more authentic joy than all the crystal chandeliers and drone light shows in the world could have provided. Elizabeth wore a simple dress she'd found at a vintage shop. James wore the same suit he'd worn to his college graduation. And Margaret wore the proudest smile I'd ever seen as she danced with her son beneath strings of fairy lights in the trees she'd planted when he was born. I think about that moment in the conference room often, the moment when the truth finally came to light. I'm not proud of losing my temper, but I don't regret standing up for my friend. Sometimes that's what love looks like, not just supporting someone through hard times, but being willing to fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. And if there's one thing I've learned from watching Margaret navigate the complicated landscape of family relationships, it's that love without honesty isn't really love at all. So if you're listening to this and something in my story resonates with you, if you recognize the warning signs of someone being isolated from those who truly care about them, if you see someone you love being manipulated or controlled, don't wait until it's almost too late to speak up. The truth might be uncomfortable, but it's always, always worth fighting for. Leave a comment below if you've ever had to stand up for someone you love. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories like this one, and remember that sometimes the most important family isn't the one we're born into or marry into, but the one we choose to build through years of loyalty and truth. This is Susan, recording from my kitchen table in Riverdale, where the best conversations have always happened. Until next time, take care of each other, and don't forget to save those receipts.